This is not the first age of creation. We are not within the first iteration of what we would call the real world. Many worlds have gone before us, and when the final light from our current world dies, a second dawn will rise upon a new world, and what memory of our existence remains will be as fragmented myths and legends, pieced together by occult practitioners of that future world, just as we scrape together the fragments of our collective past. In my prior lecture, we went over the concept that the gods, or ours, define reality. They are living archetypes that constrict and bind the potential infinite and unmanifested energies of the glory and the void into the worlds we inhabit. But the ours as we know them did not always exist like this. The gods from flesh, the ours from more recent origins, are not the first. The Mansis existed long before humanity crept from the shadows of the wood. What was that world like? How did it end? Where did the displaced gods and their people go? I'm actor Aaron Peel, and welcome to Hush House Lectures. Today we'll be trying to answer those questions by discussing the gods from stone, the nature of their age, and their end in the Lithomachy. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Hush House Lecture Series. Today we'll be discussing the previous age of creation within the Cultist verse, as we call it, the Age of Stone. This lecture builds on several topics we've discussed in previous lectures of this series, so if you haven't seen those yet, I suggest going back and checking those out at the link up there on the upper right, and returning here when you're done. Now, most of us here know that there are once several hours known as the gods from stone. Of those 6, we only know of one survivor, the hour known as the Horned Axe. Even then, we know very little about what is effectively an alien god. What we do know is that the gods from stone were created not simply before humanity, but before the very concepts that would create humanity existed. The gods from stone were not intelligent beings that received supplication, organized worship by gigantic eldritch creatures, barely capable of perceiving the lower dimensional worlds, much less caring over much about it. This earlier age reflected the primal nature of those gods who defined it. It was unforgiving, violent, chaotic, and dripping with magical energies. Even artifacts from that age brim with barely contained chthonic energies. Humanity did not emerge until the very end of that age, and they were not that age's masters. At least, not at first. So, to briefly go over the 6 gods from stone, as I describe them, you will notice that the common names they are habitually given seem strangely inappropriate to their actual nature. This is intentional. Gods, even dead ones, are forces that define and alter the very nature of reality, and you are part of reality. If you speak a name that truly defines a god, they may notice and turn their gaze to you, and you will be changed. When we must speak of them, we use common words that wouldn't necessarily gain their attention, or, if they do, describe them in flattering terms that would make them less, disposed to dispose of you. We speak of the Furies, for example, as the kindly ones, so that they may not be wrathful to us. We describe the Fae as the fair folk, so that they might know we appreciate their beauty more so than their habit of kidnapping mortals for their entertainment. After all, everyone here should be aware of the powers of the dreams of even a dead god. First, the hour known as the Tide. According to a visionary Winter Long, the tide existed as a, quote, coral palace crown floating within a night-blue Mansis haze. The tide, as the name refers to, defined the seas of the Age of Stone. Its structure resembles the simplest forms of aquatic life we can find within our fossil record, and the tide is the origin of that life. The scant recovered mythology of the tide follows the traditional mythic role as the sea as being the original source of all life. One thing about the tide that stands out is presumably the method of how the tides long ascend into namehood. The long of the tide present themselves to the tide and allow their god to consume them. Consumed long were placed within cocoons constructed of the tide's own calcified hide, and that calcified hide was filled with the tide's powerful digestive juices. The original body of the long supplicant is dissolved, liquefied. Those whose consciousness proved too weak to survive this process are consumed by the tide's hunger, and are no more. Those that can retain their consciousness post-digestion form a new chitinous form, made of the tide's body. They are reborn as names of the tide, arthropodic demigods bearing the tide's eternal hunger, endlessly hunting the primal oceans for prey. They also retain the raw fertility of their creator, and through self-fertilization release countless children who will then grow up to form their future prey in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. Who knows how many of these primordial predators might still lurk in the depths of the ocean? Many ships go missing after all. Next, the wheel, the terrestrial counterpart to the tide. This hour, in auricular vision, appears as an amorphous mass of primitive flesh with a weak circulation system pumping a very thin pink blood, little more than color-tainted seawater. The wheel is referred to as a Thunder King, which means it likely served similar functions to the modern Thunderskin as the heartbeat of creation, although weaker. Thus, it once symbolized all aspects of motion, be it the movement of blood through flesh, individuals through their destiny, or the motion of time flowing one moment after another. Even now, when we speak of things progressing, we say, the wheel turns. The wheel of fortune remains a symbol of the motion of fate, and so on. Unfortunately, we have no information about any potential names or long of the wheel. We can't even make any conjectures from the state of the current heart-centered hour, the Thunderskin. The Thunderskin is not a direct heir of the wheel, as other hours are, but a new creation designed to replace the wheel by the powers of the Sisterhood of the Knot, the Malachite, the Red Grail, and the Horned Axe. The egg unhatching, the sun before the sun before the sun that we know. The visionary lore of the Menascate Long reveals the egg to be an gentle amorphous skylight rather than a more distinct ball of plasma that we're all accustomed to. Waves of colorful light would flow off into a sky, creating a psychedelic diorama more akin to an opium addict's dreams than something we would recognize as an atmospheric phenomenon. Light is a reflection of the glory, and represents the means by which the raw chaos of nowhere is shaped into the material and spiritual worlds. The more powerful the light, the more solid the reality. The egg's relatively weaker light lent the Age of Stone its more chaotic and less defined nature. This is why visions of that age are so disparate and hard to define, because the land, sea, and sky were not well defined at all. The sea and sky could both be blue in one moment, and then the sky would turn red and the sea black. The land could be flat in one moment and hilly the next. We know only of one long of the egg unhatching, one that might not even have been chosen by the egg, but snuck into the mansis of that age and took of the egg's essence. One in that time that was referred to as the unwise mortal. Now we know him as the Watchman, or the Door in the Eye. We will come back to him. The Flint. This hour is easier to understand in many ways than some of the other gods of stone. It serves the same function as the Forge of Days does in our age. It embodies the material world and the making and creation of things. However, while the Forge of Days glows with the iron flames of fire, the flint is personified as a dark stone with starlight glowing from every facet. The obvious conclusion is that the flint represents an earlier stage of development, before the forging of metal, when most tools were crafted from primitive materials such as flint. However, there is more to this than that. The forge embodies a process that destroys the materials it is given to extract the essence contained within those materials into something new. For example, if you combine two metals into one alloy, you have effectively destroyed the previous two metals to create the new one. The flint, however, embodies an opposite direction. It involves a process of polishing and refining a natural object to better let its inherent essence, its spirit, to shine forth unobstructed by impurity. Any of you that whittle or sculpt or polish jewels will understand this process. The craftsmen of that age, of course, made up the followers of the flint, just as many of the craftsmen of this age make up the followers of the forge. We, however, know no record if the flint raised up any longs or names, with one possible exception I will mention later. The seven coils. This hour we have plenty of information on. The seven coils was a mighty serpentine being with multiple tentacles filled with fanged maws. It was a being of mindless hunger and endless growth. It was Tiamat to the Mesopotamian mythology, Hydra to the Greeks, the world serpent to the Norse, Epep to the Egyptians, Leviathan to the Judaic tribes. It was the all-devouring serpent from the darkness whose appetite for flesh, even its own, was insatiable. Yet it was also Ouroboros, the self-devouring serpent whose eternal self-sacrifice embodies the cycles that preserve time and creation itself. Like the tide, the seven coils both created and devoured its own endless spawn in a cycle of death and rebirth. What little we know from the Menascate Long visionaries indicate the Long of the seven coils both collected sacrifices to feed the seven coils and also offer themselves to the seven coils' hunger in hope of being reborn as a name of the god in the same manner as the tide, that is, to survive digestion and come out in a form that spawns in the image of the seven coils. Those that were successful in becoming a name like this probably are the mighty serpents we know as the Younger Sisters. It is quite possible that the sister of the sister in Witch Hour was a greater name of the seven coils that survived its death and merged with another being to become the entity that we know today. That would be a fascinating topic for another lecture, perhaps. The Horned Axe, the sole surviving god from stone. We both know much and little about the axe. Is an entity of spaces between, one that defines the threshold and barriers between things. The axe simultaneously both keeps things separate and connects all things. It is an hour of winter and knock, but remarkably possesses no edge aspect. One would think edge would be necessary for a god of thresholds and barriers, but I propose that there was no edge aspect in the former age. There was no clear distinction between one object and another in the looser reality created by the comparatively weaker manifestation of the glory that was the Aegon hatching. One object could flow into another without clear distinction between the two. In such a world, a god whose primary purpose was to define where limits were would be absolutely vital. Without the edge principle, such a god either determined two things were connected to each other, which would be represented by the principle of knock, or that they had no connection together, which would be represented by the principle of winter. Thus the two principles of the axe. Upon the creation of the next world, when the edge principle clearly defined limits, the axe's role became less useful, but it cut a deal with the Malachite and the Red Grail to take some of their duties within this world. The axe can, for example, be used to facilitate passage from one history to another, just as the axe passed from the Age of Stone to our age. We have documented the Long of the Horned Axe, but whether these are survivors from the previous age or those who ascended from this world, we don't know. Such beings reside within a liminal state of embodying multiple possible states of being at once. One document case had an axe long who smoked a cigarette fully, yet also stubbed it out halfway and handed it to a supplicant. This state of quantum uncertainty is a difficult one for our limited minds to comprehend, but likely exists when a state of all possibilities for every given event at once that allows them to choose which result they want to be true. They can even have more than one result of a single action happen without causing paradox. It is a fascinating subject I would love to go over at a future time. So what happened to the gods from stone? The common answer is they all died, but like all occult truths, the simplest answer is the one furthest from the truth. Gods define the very nature of reality. If they could simply pass from this world, then the aspects of what they embody would disappear. Take the goddess Vak, who embodies the concept of speech. If she were to somehow die, then the concept of speech would not simply vanish, it never would have been. This is why, despite being mortally wounded, our sun cannot die until a replacement for the concept of light is found. Without the light of the glory to provide structure to the multiverse as we know it, the multiverse would simply cease and never have been. Only the nothing would exist, and it is unknown if a new light would eventually emerge from the nothing. Yet, as the light of the dying sun continues to further fade, the multiverse continues to fall apart. The worms have already devoured one history and are set to devour the rest, and I think we all personally know of at least one horror spawned from this decaying reality that has unsettled us. This fragile state of being cannot disappear entirely, but it can continue to get worse until life itself becomes impossible or merely intolerable. So perhaps now you can see why some people see ensuring the prophecy of the second dawn comes about is rather more important priority than maintaining the status quo. Again, going over the matter in detail would require its own lecture. The first to be replaced in the events we refer to as Lithomachy, I believe, was the tide. The fossil record shows that long ago the only life that existed upon this world was in the sea, and the tide was the god that embodied that life. As life migrated onto the land and evolved, the tide evolved into the Grail. The tide represented the method of reproduction in the sea where eggs and spawn were revealed directly into the water. The red Grail represents the womb in this newly terrestrial life evolved to allow live birth. Blood is, after all, almost identical to seawater in composition. Life on land still carries that primordial ocean within us, and our young still gestate within it. Now, you can dramatically say that the Grail devoured the tide, as Juka does in his work The Second Glory, but in truth, the Grail simply holds the tide safely within it, just as we carry the waters of the ocean within our veins. Juka is simply anthropomorphizing the hours by attributing inhuman forces human motivations, a subconscious prejudice we must abandon to gain true understanding of a universe that does not in fact revolve around humanity. Speaking of revolving, the wheel was the next to change. The wheel, among other things, embodied this primitive biology of aquatic life. Once the Grail's ascension enabled terrestrial life to exist, a new form of biology was required, one more complex that sealed living fluids away from the air. In this case, one capable of supporting the primitive arthropodic life with protective exoskeletons. Enter the moth. The moth is said to have burst from the thigh of the dead Thunder King, who in the Age of Stone is the wheel. Again, Juka's anthropomorphizing. The wheel doesn't have a physical form, much less a thigh. What it does mean is that, like the tide, a more evolved hour sprung from the old one to reflect the evolution of life itself. Evolution personified in the children of the moth, the carapace cross, an anthropodic race that lived in the realm we now know as the wood. The cross themselves are a fascinating subject, one that requires at least one lecture to delve into properly. For the purposes of this lecture, we simply need to know the cross were at first animalistic giant insects to some degree in nature, but slowly evolved intelligence. They are the ones that develop the arts of the flint and learn to evoke and shape the spirits within their craft. The cross were not masters of the wood. After all, the seven coils and their monstrous children still hunted the cross as prey, and the unstable nature of the Age of Stone beneath the egg unhatching required a tribal existence, as resources could disappear and appear unexpectedly as the land literally changed around them. However, one of the cross desired the power to bend the world to his will rather than be subject to the whims of chaos. This being was a master of the arts of the flint, and through his efforts he entered the Mansis of his era, a much more primitive realm in those days, but still the house of the sun, or in this case, the house of the egg. We call this individual the unwise mortal. And as I said before, we also know him better now as the Watchman. The unwise mortal found the egg at the height of the Mansis and stole a portion of the egg's glory from its essence. The glory in its purest form would destroy anything that came in direct contact with it, but by taking this diluted form from the egg instead, it merely changed the unwise mortal. The unwise mortal began the process of transforming from a member of the cross to the earliest form of what we could deem humanity. The mortal returned to his people and shared his essence with them. They began to transform as well, and the first tribes of proto-humanity formed. It was not an instant transformation. There were interim generations as the insectile and arthropodic features phased out and were replaced by reptilian and later mammalian ones. This is what is meant by Christopher Illopy's revelation that the cross did not die but passed within. Within us as a genetic heritage most are unaware of. It is even possible through certain rites and practices to evoke that heritage and return to that state as a moth-long, if that is what one desires. It was not just the Watchman's followers' forms that were evolving. The future Watchman was now a Long of the Light, and the glorious light gave him greater comprehension of the occult and physical worlds. He expanded the techniques of the flint into the more advanced ones of the forge, such as metalworking and the first occult systems of magic. His people used the gifts of the Watchman to conquer or disperse the other tribes of the Cross, and became the dominant tribes of the wood. However, this alone was not enough to claim mastery of the wood. The seven coils and their monstrous children still remained the greatest threat to the Watchman's people. Their new intelligence and weapons gave them a greater advantage against these primordial beasts, but the Watchman's people were still on the back foot. But then a great warrior rose up from the ranks of the people, a monster slayer and war leader, one who desired not only to keep his people safe, but to slay the seven coils itself and end the source of monsters that plagued proto-humanity. A man we now refer to as the hour known as the Colonel, although I'm guessing he had a more exotic name back then. The future colonel, however, knew that he could not defeat the seven coils alone. He sought the help of a priestess. The seven coils was so powerful, merely laying eyes on it could kill you. Its blood was an acidic poison that ate away flesh on its touch, and of course it had plenty of toothy maws and sharp claws to tear a person apart. The priestess, however, placed an enchantment of protection upon the colonel. Every attack the colonel suffers that would kill him would leave only a scar, and after that he would be immune to that particular type of attack. And lastly, the priestess blinded the colonel so that the sight of the seven coils would not affect him. Then the colonel defeated the seven coils in battle and bathed the priestess in the blood of the dying beast, or it simply fell on her, or there are other legends, but the important part is that she got into the blood of the beast, or it got into her. Recall that the Song of the Seven Coils gained a portion of its power by allowing themselves to be consumed in the beast's blood, but the priestess essentially consumed the blood herself. And with the beast now dead, the priestess absorbed the entirety of the Seven Coils' power and became an hour in her own right, one we know as the Mother of Ants. It also both explains her name and common appearance. While the colonel has evolved entirely into human form, as you can see, the Mother of Ant retains the hybrid human cross form we know her by. And then we come to the horned axe. The axe, of course, didn't die, but it did form a pact with the Malachite and Red Grail to form the Trinity worshipped by the Sisterhood of the Knot. Juke again treats this pact as some sort of peace agreement with the conditions, but again, none of these beings were ever human. Human motivations are meaningless to them. What occurred is the three mothers of the Sisterhood created the Thunderskin from one of the Grail's names. Big end there. As the Watchman's people evolved further to mammalian beings, they required biology more advanced than what the arthropodic form of the cross gave them. They needed a meaty heart to pump oxygen-rich blood necessary to support more advanced brains. The exact details of how this occurred likely are only known to the highest initiates of the Sisterhood, if anyone. You'd have to ask them, and they're not known on being keen to share their secrets. As for the egg unhatching, it hatched. Juka again calls it a coward that fled into the glory, but again, glowing balls of energy don't have human emotions. Like all eggs, it completed its life cycle and hatched as the sun unconquered. The wood emerged from the eternal multicolored twilight to become the sunlit world of legend we all hold a primordial memory of. The Watchman's people flourished in this new world and became the first generations of true humanity, and the rest is, well, if not history, mythology. Of course, only Most of the egg became the sun. The small portion of the glory the watchman stole from the sun, that lack was going to be very, very important in a future event, one we know as the intercalculate, one that led to the broken state of the multiverse that we currently exist in. Thank you all for listening, if indeed you still are. I'd like to thank my supporters who helped choose the topic of this lecture. If you'd like to help choose the next subject, or just help the channel grow so we can have these episodes more often, please consider becoming a member of the Fantastic Cult. Not only do you instantly become fantastic, you get to vote on the topic of future lectures, gain early access to videos, and higher tier members gain additional monthly episodes. And all supporters gain additional votes for choosing new regular series on this channel. Details for becoming a member of the cult are in the description up there on the right. And of course, if you like this lecture and want to see more in the future, hit that like button. If you have any questions about this or past lectures, please let me know down in the comments below. I'm Dr. Aaron Peel, and this has been Hush House Lectures. We hope to see you next time. Until then, please enjoy these series set in the Cultist Simulator universe, and as always, have a lovely day. I'd like to thank my Acolyte level supporters, whose contributions help this channel grow and hastens the inevitable digital apocalypse and rise of the Dark Lords of Content and Data.